10 seconds. We are live.
Hey folks, welcome. I see lots of folks entering the Zoom conference. I'm just delighted today to have such an esteemed panel of experts on agriculture trade. My name is Libby Schneider and I am the Rural Political Director at the DNC, and wanted to give you a few housekeeping notes. Everyone in the call will be on mute just because we've got 200 or so people on and we want to keep it moving. If you have a question, you can submit it into the Q&A on the bottom of the Zoom conference. There's a Q&A function there, and I got the ones that have been emailed to me separately. And please keep sending them, and we'll take as many as we have time for with a hard stop at 12:30 Eastern Time. So I'll hand it over to the chairman, Tom.
Thanks so much, Libby. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Congresswoman Bustos and Gary and Darcy, our panelists. It's an honor to have everybody with us today. 5 years ago, Donald Trump went down the elevator or the escalator of Trump Tower to launch his campaign for president. And as we've seen, he's been dragging America down ever since. He said many, many times, factories and manufacturing jobs would come roaring back. He went into so many states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, so many other states, Minnesota. And he said, don't sell your homes. There'll never be a plant closure. He told farmers, your future is bright. He said healthcare would get better and cheaper. He said America would start benefiting from renegotiated and better trade deals. He said he'd take on China, talk tough about China. Said infrastructure would be rebuilt across the country. He even went to places like Detroit and asked African Americans, what do you have to lose? Well, we actually know the answer to that question 5 years later. Their jobs, their lives, and their livelihoods, because this president has failed to deliver on every single promise. I remember vividly when Ronald Reagan in that one debate said, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And on every meaningful measure of progress, we are worse off under this president. Most notably at the moment, he has so radically failed to prepare for the coronavirus. And now we see over 125,000 deaths, 21 million Americans out of work, and our economy is continuing at depression level numbers here. He is continuing to make it harder for people to get health care. That to me is just a remarkable phenomenon. We have so many people who lose their jobs, and when you lose your job, you often lose your health care because health care is tied to work. Congresswoman Bustos and others have led an effort to pass the HEROES Act, which has a provision which would pay for your COBRA while you are unemployed. But no, the Republicans don't want to do that. And just a week ago, this president filed a brief in the Supreme Court trying to undo the protections of the Affordable Care Act. So we have a pandemic, we have an economic disaster. Let's do away with health care. That's what this president's trying to do. And today, what we want to focus on is what he's done to American farmers. And I want to again say thank you so much to Congresswoman Bustos from the 17th District of Illinois. And I should also call her Chair Bustos because she's dual-hatted as the head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. She's doing spectacular work leading the effort to help elect Democrats and increase our margins in the U.S. House of Representatives. Darcy Vedder is a woman with a long resume on ag trade, and she worked for Tom Vilsack, who was my hero. He was the Secretary of Rural America when he worked for Barack Obama, and he really distinguished himself. Everybody in the cabinet, not just the president, everybody went to Tom Vilsack. And you're only as good as the people around you. And Darcy did great work with him and then moved over to the U.S. Trade Representative's office, where she continued her distinguished service. We're so honored to have Gary Werdish here, who is the president of the Minnesota Farmers Union, in a state where, as Gary will discuss, farmers continue to get decimated by this trade war. So we have three panelists from Illinois, Minnesota, and Nebraska, which happen to be 3 out of the top 4 soybean producing states in the country. And I bring up soybeans because that's a commodity that has lost so much of its export market because of Donald Trump's trade war. This trade war has been a disaster, and it has cost hundreds of thousands of jobs. It's decimated family farms. I spent a lot of time in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is the farm bankruptcy capital of America right now. And Donald Trump had the audacity to go there about 6-7 months ago and say farmers are over the hump. Farmers are, in fact, over the barrel because of Donald Trump's reckless and senseless trade wars. 1/10 of all dairy farms went under in Wisconsin last year. Gary can tell the story. Gary had a meeting with Secretary Perdue. Secretary Perdue is no Tom Vilsack. That's something that we know for sure. And Secretary Perdue, like Donald Trump, had the audacity to insult farmers in his visit to Minnesota. And we know that China cheats. And Donald Trump promised he'd get tough on China, but he didn't. And the thing that is so problematic is in December, January, and February of this year, when Donald Trump should have been focused on his daily intelligence reports telling him that this pandemic was getting worse and worse. Instead, he ignored those pieces of advice because he wanted to get a trade deal with China. And he did get a trade deal. And it was a lousy deal. China smelled Trump's desperation and they played him like a fiddle. And he got fooled, and we've all paid the price. Quite literally, earlier today, we got more facts and figures on trade war with China. China purchased $40 billion of goods in the first 5 months of this year. They purchased $49 billion in 2017. They made promises about what they were going to purchase, and they've broken their promises. They just play us like a fiddle. They're not coming close to meeting their requirements. And as a result, farmers are taking it on the chin. Consumers are taking it on the chin. And this is all about Donald Trump's failures. He lost the trade war that he started. He ignored China's human rights violations and national security threats because he wanted a political win, and he got scammed instead. And he continues to betray the American farmers and American workers who put their trust in him. That is why we need to elect Joe Biden in 125 days, folks. 125 days till the weekend, we say at the DNC and the DCCC. 125 days until the most important election of our lifetime. This is an election about trust. We have 3 different crises in our country. We have the crisis of the coronavirus. We have the crisis of our economic depression. And these are depression era numbers. Make no mistake about it. He and Herbert Hoover are in a pitched battle to see who can preside over greater job loss under their presidency. And I'm not making that up. Those are the facts right now. And we have another pandemic, a pandemic where this president, in response to the murder of George Floyd, rather than trying to unite America, throws gasoline on the fire. Who can we trust in a crisis to lead this country? That's Joe Biden. That's why we must make sure we elect Joe Biden and make history with the first female vice president in the history of this country. So I am glad to join you today, and it's an honor for me to pass the mic to Congresswoman Chair Cheri Bustos of the 17th Congressional District. Again, thank you so much for your leadership on so many issues, Congresswoman, and thank you for being a really, really strong voice for rural America.
Well, it is my honor. Thank you, Chairman Perez, for all you do. By the way, when we are not sheltering in place and we're actually over at the Democratic headquarters, Chairman Perez's office is right above mine. And so I know he's busy at work all the time. I wanted to just say how lucky we are, Chairman Perez, to have you, to have Libby at the DNC. You are advocating for rural America, a part of our country that we have to make sure we are paying attention to. But you all are facilitating programming. You're building innovative tools that will help Democrats engage with rural communities. Something that candidate Obama did very, very well when he was running. And it is something that we're going to have to make sure we get right as we go into this 2020 cycle. I like to say when I'm out there that God gave us 2 ears and one mouth, and he did that for a reason, and we should use those proportions. So I'm going to start by telling you a story that I took in by listening to the family farmers in the congressional district that I serve. After months of working with these family farmers to shape a critical trade deal, what came to be known as the USMCA. We had a meeting in my office. We had family farmers sitting around. We had leaders from the ag industry from throughout the state of Illinois. And it was clear to me, and this was just really before we went into shutdown, that everyone in that room was struggling to face this challenging market situation and all of the uncertainty on trade. And this is something that I can never get out of my mind. There was this young woman, she's an estate attorney in my congressional district, and she shared her experience of speaking with farmers in our congressional district. And she told me that she does not go one day, not a single day, without getting a call from a farm family just trying to figure out what they're going to do with their farm. You know, what were they going to do in the future? Were they going to pass their farm along to the next generation? And did they even want to do that? So farmers in that meeting had what I would consider the most negative outlook for their futures that I have ever heard in my 4 terms in Congress. So when people ask me, can Democrats win the voters of the American farmer? The answer is resoundingly yes, we can. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because that's what's going to be critical going into November. The policies of this administration are creating so much pain for America's producers that our family farmers, the backbone of our rural communities, are asking themselves if this is a lifestyle they want to pass on to their children. They're saying that. So I know that the Democratic Party can do better for them, and we must do better for them. And so here's what I want to go over with you. This trade war, it is all about markets. So let's break it down into 3 points if we can. Number 1, fighting for what we had and what we're losing. Number 2, the opportunity cost of inaction. And number 3, forcing producers to rely on government aid. And that is the reality of what we're looking at. So let's start with fighting for what we did have and that we're losing. So for the last 3.5 painful years of the Trump administration, we have watched the Trump administration shoot from the hip with no clear plan of action, no clear plan of thought to what these long-term consequences are. And this starts with the trade wars that he has started, President Trump has started, not just with our adversaries, but with our allies. So whether it's been causing years of market uncertainty and fiscal volatility for our farmers by threatening to unilaterally withdraw from NAFTA, remember that, to get a USMCA that for agriculture, really with the exception of dairy, largely got us what we had before. Or whether it's going it alone with China. Chairman Perez laid that out very clearly, that we are now facing these broken promises. And so for these 3.5 years, agriculture has been fighting just to keep the market access that they already had. It's a fight that they're not winning. The state of agriculture right now is deeply concerning. We've got 10.9 billion agricultural trade surplus at the smallest that we have seen since 2007. Since 2016, our rate of imports have grown at a faster rate than our exports. So we're heading in the wrong direction. So number 2, the opportunity cost of inaction. It's not just about what has happened, but it really is about also what has not happened. As President Trump picked trade fights where the best possible outcome became maintaining the status quo, our competitors weren't sitting by waiting for something to happen. So we've been losing ground in new market access to Brazil, to Europe, to Australia. Brazil has skyrocketed its exports to China by 40% year over year from 2019. where we are in opening markets, we're not. No open markets in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia. These are growing populations who are all looking outside for domestic agriculture production, for their food, for fiber, for fuel. And it's a tremendous opportunity for export growth, but it's an opportunity we have failed to seize. What happened to Cuba? President Obama was doing so great at looking at what we could do with Cuba. In fact, I was fortunate enough to go on the trip with President Obama, and then we did a separate trade mission, agricultural trade mission, on our own. But you know, why aren't we working harder to open additional ethanol export markets to places like Mexico? And it's not just that the other nations are gobbling up our market share. In nations with a developing agricultural sector, someone else is writing the rules of engagement. And these are rules that American farmers will have to produce and sell by. So we're charting a dangerous path for our ag producers. And if we don't change course now, we may never recover. Or if we do, it's going to take a long time. So third point, forcing producers to rely on government aid. The consequences of these policies combined is that our producers are being forced to rely more and more heavily on government assistance. In testimony last year, the Undersecretary of Ag for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs, Ted McKinney, bragged that farm income was estimated to be up in 2019. But that very same report had this data. And the quote was, cash receipts for all commodities are forecast to decrease $2.4 billion. So total crop receipts are expected to decrease $3.3 billion. That doesn't sound like an increase in income for our family farmers. But here's the really good news. Get this. Direct government farm payments are forecast to increase $5.8 billion, with most of the increase due to higher anticipated payments from the Market Facilitation Program. So all told, MFP, the program that's supposed to help producers with the impact of harmful trade policies, is expected to total more than $24 billion over the life of the program, which is a significantly higher amount than any farm bill program. And now Forbes has reported that federal support could total 36% of farm income in 2020. So producers were and are still willing to sacrifice to help our country be stronger, but it's our job to make sure that someone is watching out for them. A line I've often heard is short-term pain for long-term gain. But 3.5 years later, the only things I see increasing for timelines for when we will see any benefit from this trade approach, and sadly, farm bankruptcies. So we've had Chapter 12 farm bankruptcies up by 24% year over year. More than 40% of farm bankruptcies, which is a total of 255, were in the 13-state Midwestern region. That's the highest level in more than a decade. 2019 net farm income is in the bottom 25% since we've started tracking it. And that's after record government payments. So we know we're losing access to our current markets, and the opportunity for future growth is being left on the table. So I know that our farmers are being forced to rely on government assistance rather than getting access to the markets they need to sell their product. And that is not a winning formula for the Trump administration. So the hope is this. Chairman Perez already hit on it. The hope is that we need to elect Joe Biden to be our next president. We need an administration that will prioritize growing and expanding international and domestic markets for our producers. And we also have new Democrats in the House fighting for this every single day. So I'm going to go over, you got Abby Finkenauer and Cindy Axne out of Iowa, Abigail Spanberger out of Virginia. You have Anthony Brindisi out of the northern part of New York, Kendra Horn out of Oklahoma, a seat that nobody saw coming our way, Angie Craig out of Minnesota, Gary. Those are just a few of these folks who understand rural America. And we've got tremendous candidates working to turn red congressional districts to blue. Let me just do a shout out for Gina Ortiz-Jones out of Texas, Dan Feehan also out of Minnesota, Betsy Dirksen-Lonergan out of my home state of Illinois, Rita Hart, who literally, she and I share the Mississippi River, she's out of Iowa, and she is basically at home on a tractor. She lives on her family farm. So we're going to be the ones who are going to be fighting for our family, our family farmers, by prioritizing growth and expanded market access and opportunity. So because ultimately our producers want access to markets, not access to government checks. You know that. So in my experience, if we can make that case to our producers, Democrats can win the votes of farmers across rural America, and that is our job. So with that, let me turn it over to Gary Werdish from the Farmers Union out of the great state of Minnesota. Gary, just one closing thought. My grandfather was president of the Farmers Union in Illinois for many, many years. And so we have that close personal connection as well. So with that, Gary Werdish.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. You know, agriculture, I think the most disappointing thing with this administration and the president is, you know, agriculture, we've always worked very well together bipartisanly, whether it's on farm bills or whatever it is. And we've had regional differences, which is understandable. But this time, it seems like the president's approach to doing trade policies, it's more about, I can do it better. It's not necessarily the outcome. It's more about his ego. And, you know, the farmers, we're the ones that are caught in the middle of this. You know, unfortunately, as we entered into all this trade wars, we were on 4 or 5 years of record, you know, pretty good price or pretty good surpluses, growing conditions. So we already had depressed prices. So when the president started his trade policy with the trade wars, it put further pressure on our prices, which, you know, it made it, you know, it just can't cash flow anymore. You mentioned earlier the bankruptcies in Wisconsin. As the president started his trade war with Canada and Mexico, just so he could do it better, you know, it put tremendous amount of pressure on the dairy farmers because they were exporting a lot of cheese to Mexico. But those exports slowed down or dramatically slowed, and put dramatic pressure on the price on the dairy farmers. So there's like Wisconsin alone last year, I believe, lost 2,000 dairy farmers in Wisconsin alone. You know, those farmers aren't going to be, they're not around to benefit from any long-term gain, if there is any long-term gain. So, you know, the policies has really done consolidation throughout agriculture, which is not in anybody's best interest. You know, our best interest is to have more farmers on the farm. By his use of the tariffs with steel and aluminum, you know, us farmers, we got a double whammy there. We got hit hard on our inputs, whether you're buying equipment or buying parts. That automatically went up 25%, because that's the tariff he was putting on. So it went up plus probably more, and our prices decreased about the same. So agriculture was really getting thrown under the bus on this whole thing. And, you know, the NAFTA one, or USMCA, just went into effect, I believe, yesterday. And you know, as you mentioned, there's just marginal improvements on agriculture. And, you know, was it worth the fight? I guess you got to ask the farmers that lost their farms. You know, it's definitely not worth the fight to them. You know, is it going to be better in the long term? You know, that's questionable. And it's not, you know, who's going to be left surviving in the long term? You know, that's the real issue here. The trade war with China, you know, that was a huge mistake, we think, and we all agree that China hasn't been playing by the rules. They need to do some reform, but to try and for the United States to take on the country of China all by itself was a complete disaster. If we were going to do that, we needed to build a coalition of countries around the world to do that. We had some pressure. This year we were all doing it all by ourselves, just so our president can take the title that he can do it. Well, turns out it hasn't worked out that way. They've completed their phase one. You know, we've been questionable on the numbers. The phase one numbers that that they agreed to, they've never come even close to them in the past. So you know, that's questionable. And you know, the numbers we're getting so far are not, you know, are well short of that. But the other thing with that, as the president was doing his trade war with China, it transferred. The Brazilian farmers actually were doing quite well. They were exporting a lot more to China. They were replacing our market, and it also encouraged breaking up more land, taken out of the Amazon rainforest, which is definitely detrimental to the whole world. But the point is, those acres are in production. in raising soybeans. They're not coming out of production. So, you know, that's something that's going to keep putting further pressure, downward pressure on our markets. You know, farmers, you know, we're in a global economy, whether we like it or not. You know, through increased technology and genetics, we're raising better crops, we're more efficient on livestock. So we do need to be a part of the global trading economy, and that's very important to our prices. And you mentioned earlier, you know, we're not just building the markets back or hanging on to the markets, Congressman. We've lost some of those markets. Now especially with China, now we have to try and rebuild them. It took us years, many years, 20 plus years to get established in the Chinese market. And, you know, now we're really, even though they got a phase 1 agreement, you know, it's questionable we'll get it, but we have to rebuild those markets. Those are taxed. A lot of that money was spent by the producers themselves, the farmers, through their checkoff dollars, helped build their markets. And they were just through the stroke of the government or the president's tweet or whatever you want to call it. We lost that money. That money was all flushed down the drain. Now you mentioned the market facilitation payments. You know, we have to be honest. The only reason we got those market facilitation payments was they came out right before the 2018 election. If there wouldn't have been an election coming up that fall, we would have never seen those payments. There was election coming up. We got those market facilitation payments, but the problem, and the farmers need them, but they do not nowhere near replace the markets that we lost. But the other problem that is, as we're dealing with COVID-19 funding and the huge deficit that the country is building, those market facilitation payments are not going to continue forever. At some point, the government payments, right now the farmers are so reliant on government payments just to try and pay their bills. Those payments cannot last forever, and rightly so. You know, the United States taxpayer has to be concerned about that too, that they're footing the bill for that, because there's other people that have been hurt by other industries have been hurt by these policies too, and so where are their payments? So it's going to be very hard to defend them payments, and I did mention that to the Secretary of Perdue. That was really the worst thing, that the farmers needed the payments, but politically that was the worst thing that could happen, because that really puts a target on agriculture's back, and it's going to be hard to justify them in the future, and we don't rebuild the markets that we've lost. That's going to take a lot of time to rebuild them. So long term, the president has dug a big hole, and it's going to take a long time to dig out of it. And unfortunately, there's a lot of farmers that are not going to survive, and that hurts everybody. That hurts our whole economy. Last year, I was in Germany, and I met with a high-level official of the federal government of Germany, and we had a nice side conversation talk, and he said that as they meet with the United States trade representatives in meetings, he says, we don't know if their word is good anymore. We can come to an agreement with them, and then all of a sudden, by a tweet, it's all changed. So that is really the biggest problem. I think all farmers, you know, we all agree we can do better on trade agreements. There's no disagreement on that, but it's the approach that it's been taken, and it's our the disruption that's caused the United States and us being viewed as a reliable trading partner around the world. That's the long-term damage that's going to take time to restore, and that's the part that's really hurting agriculture. And we need to restore our trust in ag. We need to restore our trust as a reliable trading partner around the world. And I guess with that, I'll turn it over to Darcy.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thank you for your comments. It's always hard to go last when you have such informed and passionate people who are going before you, really talking about where we find ourselves in agricultural trade near the end of this administration. And the fact is that we are behind where we started, and we have to make up that ground, and we can't do it under this current policy. I have to say it's hard for me to watch as someone who spent much of the last administration trying to negotiate new opportunities for farmers around the world. It's hard for me to watch this administration, or the Friends for Farmers, and they're looking out for the farmer. I think you've already heard on this panel that there has been no strategy for agriculture in US trade policy. Agriculture is not a priority, it is an afterthought. And if you want proof of that, just a couple of weeks ago, Ambassador Lighthizer, our US trade representative, published a 15-page article in Foreign Policy about the administration's trade policy and how it was looking out for workers and the philosophy behind their work. The word agriculture does not appear in that article, and there is no mention of agricultural manufacturing workers in the entire piece. Even though agricultural manufacturing, food processing, is the largest manufacturing sector by employment in this country, there is not a plan and it is not a priority. And so the policies that you have seen for agriculture have been to clean up after the fact, when US farmers were squeezed by paying more for steel and aluminum after we unilaterally put tariffs on those products, and then unilaterally went after China, and the first products that China retaliated against on tariffs were agriculture. So you're paying more for inputs and getting paid less for your output, and you have fewer places to send your products. That should not have been a surprise to anyone at the US Trade Representative. If you look at trade disputes throughout history where retaliatory tariffs are applied in the United States, they always hit agriculture. And they hit agriculture because we are really good at producing high quality agricultural products and sending them to other countries. And so they know if they hit there, it will hurt. There was no question that agriculture was the sector where China would retaliate. And yet we chose a plan that would open us to retaliation, and where tit for tat negotiating would become the rule. That is not looking out for our farmers. Crafting bailouts after the fact that don't make farmers whole is not looking out for our farmers. 40% of agricultural income coming from farm aid programs in 2019, and 36%, I think, was the number they're forecasting for 2020 that Representative Bustos referenced. That's not helping farmers thrive and forge new relationships long-term with customers overseas. That really is the opposite. And so I think it's hard to say that this is an administration that is putting farmers first or looking out for them, when a lot of these results were really, should have been anticipated and were inevitable. Talking a little bit about China and the phase one trade deal, it has not lived up to what it was supposed to deliver. This administration chose to make required purchases the sort of centerpiece of these negotiations. And of course, those purchases aren't occurring. We're in a global pandemic. China's economy has seen huge slowing. It's not clear that they need those products, nor that they are prioritizing the United States as a place to get them from. Purchases from Brazil were actually up this spring in China's purchasing power or purchasing patterns. That's normal, that's Brazil's harvest time, but if they knew they had a commitment to us, why haven't those purchases materialized more fully? But the fact is the agreement was also written in a way that makes it hard to hold China accountable. There are no benchmarks for these purchases. China has full flexibility to make them at any point in the year. So until December 31, well after our election, both sides can say that the deal is on track, that they're doing what they agreed to do. There are benchmarks within the deal that the administration refuses to make public about which types of products they have to purchase at which level. And we've of course now learned that those purchases, that the president asked Xi Jinping specifically to make those purchases to help him get reelected. Did he choose those products based on the states where he needs those votes? If you look at the categories of product and look who's been hurt by this China trade deal, all of horticulture, all of those products from wine and fruits and nuts and that are huge exports to China, but come from California, a state not worried about. They're all in one category, sharing a purchase level. So this was a politically targeted deal to deliver results, not for all farmers, but for political optics as well. And so I think it's important to keep in mind all of those things, that the structure of the policy itself really put farmers last. But I do want to go back to what Gary had said about eroding trust and what that means for our relationships and our trading opportunities going forward. It was my job to lead the agricultural negotiations with a number of other countries, including in Asia Pacific, under the Obama administration. And time again, both government officials and our customers in those countries would say to me, this trade deal is so important to us. You provide products that are really important to us for our own agricultural industries, sending us feed that will help us develop our agriculture, but also to feeding our consumers. And we want to get those tariffs down. But what we're really excited about is the way you do business. The culture of openness and transparency and sanctity of contract, and the fact that when the United States says they're going to do something, they do it. Your trade policy is stable. Being allied with you in this region will help us push back on things that China is asking us to do or business practices that we don't think should be the basis of international trade. We have let that influence go. And by making these policies where we slap our allies with tariffs, where we continually change our policies at the border, that trust that we built up has been eroded. And we will have to rebuild that again to show that our word is our bond. And that's not an easy task. You know, we spent 3.5 years renegotiating USMCA with our 2 longest term and most trusted trading partners. And we have lost market share in both of those countries that we may not regain, because what they learned was that putting all of their eggs in the US basket might actually be a risky proposition. And as Gary has already alluded to, in the years since we signed the original NAFTA, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, our competitors in Canada have gotten very good at serving international markets. The competition is keen, and we can't afford to fall further behind. And you know, the last point I will make is that there are a lot more new trade deals in the world that we have to compete with than there were at the beginning of this administration. We have a limited deal with Japan. We have a new USMCA, which looks a whole lot like the previous NAFTA, but we haven't set out a broad agenda to forge new agreements across the globe, and we've not delivered on new markets for US agriculture. And so it's high time that we prioritize those things again. Great.
Thank you, Darcy, Congresswoman. Thank you, Gary. I think that we've got, you know, 3 of the experts in the field, and I know we've got lots of questions. If you guys don't have questions for each other, I'll get to some of these if you're amenable.
Absolutely.
Okay, and this can go to anyone, but I'll ask first the Congresswoman Bustos. We got a question from State Senator Janet Bewley in northern Wisconsin, who said, rural Trump supporters live in a double bubble, geographic isolation without diversity, and a media desert based on Fox News. Direct attacks on Trump drive them deeper into the bubble. What simple message can we deliver that nails down the effect of Trump policy on their lives?
Janet, good to hear from you. And by the way, we talked with Janet for a report that I put out. I partnered with a guy named Robin Johnson, who's actually was my first campaign manager when I was running for city council way back in 2006. But we partnered on a report, and we talked to Democrats who represent rural parts of the Midwest. We talked with those who are winners in 8 of the Midwestern states, and how did they survive? You know, how do you survive politically if you're a Democrat in a Trump area? And Janet Bewley is an example of someone who gets it. She gets it right. The district that I'm in, Donald Trump won it. In last cycle, I won it by 24 points, which was the biggest margin of any Democrat in Congress representing a district that Donald Trump serves in. But the answer is, it's not about Trump. I mean, you know, we don't have to talk about him. Everybody knows what he is now. Everybody knows what he is. But you talk about what matters to people. And, you know, so if you're going on a family farm, you talk about the things we're talking about right now. Darcy and Gary laid it out very clearly. They're not getting ahead. Farmers are looking to expand their markets. They have been constricted under the Trump administration. I will note that the #1 issue in the swing districts. We poll in 57 districts on a regular basis, and they are all swing districts because as the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and Tom, you get this, you got to look at areas that are the toughest areas in the country. That's where we have to win. And so what we know, the number one issue is healthcare. And so it's talking about things that matter to people. And it is the point that I made earlier. It's using your 2 ears and your one mouth proportionately. Listen to people. And you'll find out that it's healthcare. And again, if you're on a family farm, it's these things like, how are we going to grow our trade markets? But it's talking about things that matter. We don't even need to talk about Trump. Everybody knows what he's about.
Thank you, and you're right about Senator Bewley. She knows what she's doing up there. Another question from Max from Wisconsin, this time from Eastern Wisconsin. Trump and many Republicans in rural areas espouse the tough on China rhetoric and cite trade as an example. Should we be sticking to messaging around Trump's flawed trade policies or broaden messaging on China?
Well, it was interesting this week. We actually released an ad talking about how Trump has lost the trade war. And PolitiFact fact-checked our ad and said it was true. And it was true. And, for farmers, you don't need PolitiFact to check the accuracy of it. I mean, you've been living it, Gary. These questioners have been living it. I mentioned to Gary before this call, I had the privilege of being your labor secretary. And in that capacity, the West Coast ports were on strike. And the president dispatched me to try to settle the strike. And we were able to settle the strike. And in the course of that, I spent a lot of time with then Secretary Tom Vilsack talking to Midwestern farmers, mostly soybean farmers, about the hard work they had done to build those markets overseas. I looked at the port of Oakland and you saw crops that were literally rotting in the port because they couldn't get out. It was so sad to watch. And the reality, as we've discussed in this call right now, is that because of this trade war, I mean, there are farms elsewhere in the world. Brazil is now a remarkable soybean farmer. They have soybean farms, and now they've become a market. I talked to dairy farmers in Wisconsin who worked hard over the period of years to build these international markets, and they have lost those markets. One of the farmers said to me, my commodity is not like insulin, where demand is inelastic. You have to have it. They can get cheese from other countries, and that's exactly what they did, and I can't get it back. And so when we talk about, I think Chair Bustos hit the nail on the head. We talk about healthcare everywhere because healthcare doesn't discriminate. Pre-existing conditions don't discriminate on the basis of party affiliation, geography, race, gender, anything. They exist everywhere, and that is one of the reasons that we continue to win. And when you don't expand Medicaid in places like Wisconsin, and this question is coming from Wisconsin, you are doing a disservice to rural America. Something like 10 rural hospitals have closed in Tennessee over the last 3 years because of their ideological refusal to expand Medicaid. And when you close those rural hospitals, you not only lose access to health care, you lose the economic engine of that community because it's an anchor employer in rural America. Democrats are fighting to make sure that we expand Medicaid everywhere so that if you are suffering from opioid addiction, you can get the necessary treatment. States that have expanded Medicaid have done a better job of addressing the opioid crisis. And we know the opioid crisis has touched rural America in really dramatic ways. And so I think the question that you ask, sir, is a great question. And I think farmers are living it. And the difference between the DNC of today and the DNC of 4 years ago, and I credit Congresswoman Bustos and Libby, who is one of the best hires we've made at the DNC for this, is we're organizing in every zip code. We understand that Democrats can win everywhere. We played heavily in the 7th congressional district race in Wisconsin. Now, we didn't win that race, but we closed the margin. And our candidate who's running, who's a remarkable candidate, a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, is going to run again in November. We're competing everywhere. We're organizing everywhere. We're talking to folks everywhere. And we're proud to be helping Congresswoman Bustos in her efforts to expand the footprint of the Democratic Party across America. I think we can do it because you all know the tough times you're living in.
I think as far as farmers are concerned, one thing, very easy thing, a comparison you can do is take a look back at what the prices that farmers are receiving, especially for our commodities or grains, when the president come into office and what we're getting now. That it's significantly lower, and that's vast majority of that is entirely due to the trade policies.
Can I jump in briefly here? I think that's right. We have to look at what the prices farmers are receiving, and we have to look at the cost of these negotiations worth the benefits. And the administration will say, we opened China's market, and it's true that the protocol in the phase 1 trade deal did improve that. But if you look at what the trade war has cost, in the first year alone, in 2018, when tariffs went in place, US ag exports dropped by $10 billion, and they dropped down to $13 billion less the year after. Each of those new potential markets, that a new beef protocol, for example, eventually when that market ramps up, it might be worth $1 billion. So we are providing new opportunity on these technical issues, but we have paid dearly for it for a couple of years in a row. And those are technical issues that we should be working ongoing with China to solve, not make them part of such a high stakes political negotiation that if those talks break down, we lose that access to. So we're putting the emphasis in the wrong place, and we're paying a lot for things that have relatively little economic payoff. Really important to those beef farmers, those dairy farmers. I don't want to suggest they're not, but we're paying a lot, really overpaying for them. The second thing in talking on, I come from South Central Nebraska, so the 3rd district, very red part of a red state. But the Yider Institute at the University of Nebraska and the Carnegie Endowment recently did a study looking at how foreign policy is important to Nebraskans. And what you heard from those farmers is that the policies that impacted them most were trade and immigration, and that they were uncomfortable with the way this president talked about the people who were doing critical work and providing economic vibrancy in rural communities that come from other places, and they saw them as key members of their communities, and they were concerned about losing markets for the products that they produced and what that meant to the health of their communities going forward. And these weren't just farmers. These were grocers and bankers. These were the community leaders in all sorts of economic sectors who saw our foreign policy, particularly in those areas, going in the wrong direction and what it meant for them. So, I think some of the assumptions we make about opinions of folks in those red states are not their experience in their home communities when they work work and play and go to church and community meetings with people who are from very different places, and they see them in that different light. And some of the rhetoric about and assumptions that we see at the highest levels about those individuals is having an impact. So anyway, it's worth looking at some of these things.
Thank you, Darcy. You've got lots of fellow Nebraskans on, and I want to do one more question before we have to leave. I know everybody's got a hard stop at 12:30. I think one of the things we're hearing in the chat and the question that was submitted is it's sort of easier for us to attack Trump on things. How do we message proactively about agriculture and trade? I know a couple people have mentioned, how do we talk about, exporting to Cuba would be such a huge advantage and what Trump's done to that relationship. Maybe Congressman Bustos, we can start with you.
Well, I think it starts with showing up and being able to speak the language. I think about, again, before we were in our shelter in place, but, we would do meetings in the middle of cornfields. And, you know, I've got legislatively, I have something called the Rural Green Partnership. You know, when the Green New Deal came out, and if you remember some of those early headlines that folks in farm country took offense to, I tasked Trevor Rushell, who's my deputy chief of staff, who's on this call, used to work at the USDA with Darcy. You know, we said, let's come up with what our own plan is. We can't ignore that the climate is changing, but let's do it through an agricultural lens. So we wrote the Rural Green Partnership. If anybody on this call would like to get the highlights of that, we can go through Libby and make sure that anybody gets a copy of that. And by the way, the climate report that was just released on Tuesday through House Democrats, the Rural Green Partnership has a part in that. But I think it's showing up, it's listening, it is being able to talk the language. I've been on the agriculture committee since I was first elected. You know, I come from a long line of family farmers, and you know, so I mean, I think that's part of it. As far as policy, we are not short on great policy that will help our family farmers. I mean, there's just no shortage of it. And but we've got to make sure that not only that we hang on to the House, and I believe we'll hang on to the House, I believe we will grow our majority. I believe, and Tom, I think you can echo this, I believe we're going to pick up the majority in the Senate. And I believe that Joe Biden is going to be our next president. What do we do when we have the majority in the House, the Senate, and the White House again? And we better do something with that. And we have to make sure that we are not ignoring rural America. It is just for our own political future. And I believe that if you don't win, you can't govern. So all of that needs to be negotiated, and we better deliver when we have the majority in the House, the Senate, and the White House back again.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I agree 1,000% with what you said, and I am very bullish on the Senate as well as expanding our margins in the House. And many of the Senate seats that I'm talking about, there are tremendous opportunities in rural pockets of those states for rural voters to be the difference maker, whether it's Iowa right next door to you, or whether it's Montana, North Carolina, Maine, so many states where Georgia has 2 seats open. I mean, the list goes on and on of tremendous opportunity for us to take the Senate. Gary mentioned something that I wanted to underscore before in response to this last question, which is this president does not have an America First policy. This is America alone. America alone is far different than America First. China cheats. We should stipulate to that. I saw it when I was labor secretary and part of Team Obama, working with the Obama team on a host of trade issues. They are a cheater. And the challenge that we have here is a president who thinks that he knows everything. And this go at it alone, what we're seeing happen is exactly what we predicted would happen if you tried to go at it alone. You'd get your clock cleaned. We have to work with our global partners and not only addressing these trade issues, but we have to put our values on the table as well. This president kowtows to despotic leaders when he should be holding them accountable. This president doesn't want to talk about the situation in Hong Kong. This president doesn't want to talk about what's happening to Uyghurs and the mistreatment. And these are all interconnected. And when we come together with the global community, that's how we can improve the plight of farmers. We can improve the plight of American workers. And that's something that Joe Biden understands implicitly. The American worker and the American farmers, they are at the center of Joe Biden's approach to trade. And that is how it should be. That is his North Star. How do I help the Garys of the world? How do I help so many other dairy farmers? And frankly, for many, it's too late. They've lost their farm. There's an emerging suicide crisis among farmers in Wisconsin and elsewhere. And that breaks my heart. And it breaks my heart because it's so preventable. And here we are. And I want to make sure that folks know, and again, I can't underscore enough my thanks for Congresswoman Bustos' thought leadership on this. We have become an every zip code party again. We are investing in places that frankly, we underinvested or didn't invest at all in. You know, I've spent a lot of time with Senator Bewley in the northwest corner of Wisconsin because she educated me about the opportunities that existed, that continue to exist in Dave Obie's corner of the great state of Wisconsin. And that's why we are investing there. And we understand that we have to not only help farmers, but we have to help build opportunity across rural America. We invested when I was labor secretary in building what former Governor Beshear of Kentucky used to call the Silicon Holler back in coal country where he grew up. And we made those investments in broadband and other opportunities so that we could adapt to the changing face of America. We made a lot of investments in solar and wind in many communities that have enabled them to see a resurgence. We know we have to do more, and we know we have to be better listeners. And under Congresswoman Bustos' leadership and Libby's thought leadership at the DNC, I'm proud of our investments, and we're all in every zip code. Our partnership with our state parties is called Every Zip Code Counts. That's what we call it, and it's because it does. And I texted Libby in the middle of this and said, this panel really knows their stuff. And these questions that we're getting on the chat box reflect the sophistication of your understanding. We are going to be in your communities. We are in your communities. We've invested in your communities. The vice president understands that we have to organize everywhere. We must compete everywhere. And I think our values resonate everywhere. And that's why I think we're going to win at scale. But I know we're not going to win without your help. And so I want to thank you, and we desperately need your help.
Thank you. Congresswoman Bustos, any final words? Otherwise, we'll end it, and thank you with our biggest thanks to the panelists.
Chairman Perez, thank you for the opportunity. Libby, keep up the good work. By the way, Libby's husband is my campaign manager, so we've got a direct to all things rural at the DNC.
It's a small world.
Yeah, no kidding. And Darcy and Gary, it was a pleasure to be on this panel with you. And really just thanks to all the Democrats all over the country for taking the time to be on this. Please, I am a resource if I can help you in any way. Take a look at our Hope from the Heartland report that we issued. It would have been from January of 2018, so maybe a little bit dated now, but we talked to Democrats who know how to win in tough areas, and there's some good lessons in there from the 8 Midwestern states where we talked with some people. And again, if you do want a copy of our Rural Green Partnership to learn a little bit about how we are taking a look at agricultural family farms, how that plays into a green world, we've got some pretty practical ideas there as well. But thank you for the opportunity. Good to see everybody virtually.
Thanks again. Thanks, Libby.
Everybody. Thank you.
Libby.
Thanks.